In July of 2019, a young woman named Emily Carter boarded a flight from London to Johannesburg, South Africa. At just 23 years old, Emily was already a dedicated medical student with a bright future ahead of her. Friends described her as fiercely independent, someone who had always wanted to carve her own path. While many of her classmates spent their summer breaks shadowing doctors or preparing for exams, Emily chose something different. She wanted adventure, something that would take her far from lecture halls and hospital wards. She booked a solo safari trip through southern Africa, telling her family she wanted to see the raw beauty of the wild before burying herself in years of clinical practice. Her journey began smoothly. She landed safely, rented a small jeep, and made her way to a private safari lodge near the border of Kruger National Park. She filled her social media with images of sprawling landscapes, elephants grazing by the roadside, and brilliant sunsets painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Emily's parents in London received nightly updates, short but reassuring messages telling them that she was safe and happy. On her third day, she mentioned in one post that she wanted to venture beyond the typical guided tours. She wanted to explore the real wilderness, as she called it, away from the tourist groups and the comfort of organized safaris. It was the last time her family heard from her. On the evening of July 14th, the lodge staff grew concerned. Emily had signed out for what she described as a short personal drive through the reserve, a common activity for guests who wanted privacy. She never came back. At first, the staff assumed she had decided to camp outside, but when she failed to appear for breakfast the following morning, they alerted local authorities. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Messages sent by her parents showed no signs of being read. What began as mild concern quickly escalated into panic. Search parties were organized immediately. Rangers swept the area surrounding the lodge, hoping she had simply driven down an unfamiliar path and gotten stuck. Helicopters scanned the landscape for the distinct white jeep she had rented. But the hours dragged into days and not a trace of Emily appeared. What unsettled authorities most was how carefully planned her trip had seemed. She wasn't reckless. She had medical training, knew the basics of survival, and carried a well-documented itinerary. Yet she had vanished without leaving behind so much as a tire track. News of her disappearance spread quickly, first in South Africa and then back home in the UK. Media outlets described her as a promising student whose love of travel had led her into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Her family flew in within days, pleading for international help. Still, there were no answers. The wilderness seemed to have swallowed her whole. For investigators, the question lingered. Had Emily wandered too far and fallen victim to the unforgiving landscape, or had someone else crossed her path before she could ever return? South African police wasted no time once the disappearance was reported. The lodge staff confirmed the timeline. Emily had signed out in the afternoon, planning what she called a brief drive, but she never returned. To piece together her movements, investigators first checked her lodge room. Everything was still neatly arranged. Her clothes, her toiletries, and even her laptop were left behind. The only items missing were her safari gear and her small backpack. It gave the impression that she had intended only a short excursion, not a trip that would take her days away. The first breakthrough came when police checked her vehicle records. The Jeep had been rented under her name, and GPS data showed that she drove well beyond the boundaries of the reserve. This immediately raised concerns. Guests were allowed to explore certain areas, but venturing further into remote terrain required a guide, both for safety and legal reasons. Why would Emily, a cautious and educated traveler, make such a decision? Some officers believed she might have been following someone else, perhaps another vehicle she trusted. Investigators tracked her movements using roadside surveillance cameras. Several security cameras along the main highways captured her Jeep traveling steadily in the direction of another private safari park nearly 200 kilometers away. This was strange because she hadn't told the lodge staff about visiting another reserve. More troubling was that, according to the park's visitor records, Emily never checked in. The official gate logs and security cameras showed no sign of her arrival. Somewhere in the last stretch of her journey, she disappeared without explanation. Search teams were sent to the stretch of road between the highway and the park entrance. After hours of combing through dirt tracks and secondary roads, they discovered her rented Jeep deep in the bush. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. The vehicle was locked, yet the keys were still in the ignition. Her passport, wallet, and even her cell phone were on the front seat. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and no indication of a struggle inside. Everything looked undisturbed, as if Emily had calmly stepped out and walked into the wilderness of her own accord. Forensic teams swept the car for fingerprints and DNA. Nothing unusual surfaced, no traces of an unknown person. Yet the placement of her belongings was deeply unsettling. Why would someone leave behind every valuable item they had? If this was a robbery, the thief had ignored cash, documents, and electronics. If it was an accident, why lock the vehicle with the keys still dangling from the ignition? The discovery left investigators facing a mystery that didn't fit any familiar pattern. While search operations intensified, detectives also began interviewing nearby farmers, rangers, and lodge workers. A few reported seeing a young woman in a Jeep matching Emily's, but their accounts varied. Some swore she was alone, others thought they noticed another vehicle trailing behind her. The inconsistency of these reports only fueled speculation. Had she met someone during her trip? Someone who convinced her to change course? Or was she being followed without realizing it? By the end of the second week, investigators realized they were not simply looking for a missing person lost in the wilderness. The strange circumstances surrounding the abandoned Jeep suggested something more deliberate, something that pointed toward human involvement. For Emily's family, the case had shifted from a hopeful search to a nightmare of uncertainty. The wilderness was vast, but the unanswered questions were even bigger. A week after the abandoned Jeep was discovered, search teams working near a dried riverbed came across the first piece of physical evidence directly tied to Emily. Half buried in the sand, they uncovered a medical textbook stained with blood. The inside cover had Emily's name written in her handwriting, confirming it belonged to her. The book was battered, its edges torn and smudged with dirt, as if it had been hastily discarded or dragged by the elements. Forensic testing revealed that the blood on its pages was hers, though the amount was too little to suggest a fatal injury. Still, its discovery changed the tone of the investigation entirely. The theory that Emily had simply gotten lost in the wild no longer fit. Something violent had occurred. The area surrounding the riverbed was searched meticulously, but no other belongings or human remains were found. No footprints, no tire tracks, no clothing, just the book. It seemed deliberately placed as though someone wanted it to be found, a breadcrumb leading investigators deeper into a puzzle. The eerie isolation of the item left many unsettled. It did not look like the random result of an accident. Detectives turned their attention to Emily's online activity in the days before her disappearance. They learned she had been active on a private travel forum, posting about her trip and asking for advice on exploring less popular safari spots. Among her posts, there were exchanges with a user who called themselves Wild Tracks. This individual claimed to be a local guide with access to hidden parts of the reserves that ordinary tourists never saw. Emily, always curious and drawn to the unusual, appeared intrigued by the idea. In one post, she mentioned possibly arranging to meet him. The troubling part came when investigators attempted to trace the account. Just days after Emily vanished, the entire profile disappeared from the forum. No IP addresses, no contact information, nothing remained. The timing was too precise to ignore. It raised the possibility that Emily had placed her trust in a stranger who was deliberately concealing their identity. Detectives also examined her phone, which had been left inside the Jeep. Though most data seemed normal, forensic analysts discovered fragments of messages that had been deleted. These fragments hinted at communication with someone offering to show her a different kind of adventure. The phrasing was vague but unsettling. Authorities could not determine whether Emily had been coerced or if she willingly followed this person. The discovery of the book and the digital traces of a mysterious contact shifted the investigation's direction. The focus was no longer solely on the wilderness itself, but on the human element. Who was this supposed guide, and why had their online presence vanished so abruptly? Speculation ran wild in both the media and the local community. Some believed Emily had been lured into a trap by someone preying on solo travelers. Others wondered if she had willingly gone off the grid, perhaps chasing an experience far more dangerous than she realized. What was certain, however, was that her disappearance was no longer a simple case of being lost in the African bush. The clues pointed towards something carefully orchestrated, a deception that left her family and investigators increasingly convinced that someone had planned her vanishing with chilling precision. 2 months passed with little progress, and the case of Emily Carter began to draw international headlines. Pressure mounted on South African authorities as her family refused to give up hope, holding press conferences and demanding answers. It was during this time that a small but crucial lead emerged. An anonymous call was placed to local police by a farmer who lived on the fringes of the reserve. He claimed he had noticed unusual activity near an old hunting cabin deep in the bush. The structure had long been abandoned, falling apart after years of disuse, yet in recent weeks he had seen faint lights at night and heard the sound of a generator running. Investigators quickly mobilized to the location, unsure of what they might find. The cabin stood in isolation, surrounded by thick brush and a rough dirt path leading up to it. On the surface, it appeared deserted, windows shattered, roof partially collapsed, and weeds overtaking the yard. But closer inspection revealed recent tire marks on the ground and boot prints pressed into the soil. Inside the cabin, the rooms were stripped bare, almost empty, as though someone had tried to erase any trace of habitation. However, the discovery came in the form of a hidden entrance beneath the floorboards. A trapdoor led down to a small underground storage area. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and oil. What investigators found there was chilling. Against one wall, coils of rope were neatly stacked, alongside tranquilizer darts and empty syringes. Old lanterns, stained tarps, and rusted metal chains hung from hooks. In the far corner, a plastic storage bin held an assortment of personal items. Investigators opened it to find watches, wallets, and cameras. Some belonged to tourists who had been reported missing over the last few years. Among these possessions was Emily's black backpack. Inside, her safari journal was tucked neatly, as though she had been using it only days earlier. The most disturbing detail was the last page of the journal. Emily's handwriting stopped abruptly, cutting off in the middle of a sentence that described the sound of a vehicle approaching outside her lodge room. The unfinished words suggested she had been interrupted suddenly, perhaps at the very moment she was taken. For investigators, it was the strongest evidence yet that Emily had not vanished by accident. Forensic testing on the cabin revealed DNA traces belonging to multiple individuals. Some matched missing tourists from previous cases, while others remained unidentified. The cabin was no longer just a suspicious site. It was now considered a crime scene linked to multiple disappearances. Attention soon turned toward a name that surfaced in the investigation: Daniel Voss. He was a former safari guide, dismissed years earlier after being accused of misconduct with travelers. Though never formally charged, he had a reputation for being aggressive, manipulative, and reckless. Records showed he had vanished from the public eye around the same time tourists began disappearing. The evidence from the cabin, combined with his history, pointed directly toward him. What unsettled detectives most was the realization that this was not a random act against Emily alone. The items in that underground room painted the picture of a man who had been hunting vulnerable travelers for years, luring them with the promise of adventure and ensuring they never returned. Emily's case had started as a single mystery, but the cabin revealed a much larger, more terrifying pattern. Just as investigators prepared to issue an international warrant for Daniel Voss, a new discovery turned the entire case on its head. During a grid search of the thick bushland behind the abandoned hunting cabin, a team of officers unearthed what appeared to be disturbed soil. At first, it seemed like an animal's den, but further digging revealed the edge of a shallow grave. The officers worked through the night, carefully excavating the site, and what they uncovered was far darker than anyone had anticipated. Inside the grave were human remains, not one body, but fragments from 3 separate victims. Forensic analysis later confirmed they belonged to tourists who had been reported missing over the last 5 years. All 3 had vanished while traveling alone through different parts of South Africa, their cases long thought to be unrelated. The grim discovery connected them all, placing their final moments within reach of the same man investigators were now desperately trying to track down. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. What began as the story of a missing medical student had transformed into the exposure of a serial predator who had been operating undetected for years. Each victim had traveled alone. Each had sought adventure off the beaten path, and each had crossed paths with a figure who seemed to vanish like smoke after luring them in. Despite this breakthrough, one thing remained agonizingly absent: Emily herself. Her backpack and journal were undeniable evidence of her presence at the cabin, but her body was not among those found in the grave. That absence fueled endless speculation. Some believed she was buried elsewhere, in a grave that had yet to be discovered. Others thought she might have been kept alive longer than the other victims, hidden away before being moved. A few even clung to the faint hope that she was still alive, a captive who had not yet been found. Theories spread like wildfire. Journalists and amateur sleuths pieced together timelines of Emily's last known movements, noting that her disappearance coincided almost exactly with the disappearance of Voss himself. It raised a chilling possibility. Had she been his final victim, or had she somehow survived and vanished with him into the wilderness? International agencies became involved, hoping to bring Voss to justice. But months turned into years, and no definitive trace of him was ever located. Sightings were reported across rural South Africa and even in neighboring countries, but none were ever confirmed. Each lead dissolved into frustration, leaving behind only questions. For Emily's family, the lack of closure was devastating. They clung to the evidence found, the journal, the interrupted words on the page, the proof that she had fought to record her experiences until the very last moment. Those details became a haunting reminder of how quickly an ordinary trip could transform into a nightmare. The exposure of the hunting cabin and the graves ensured the case would never be forgotten. It became one of the most notorious tourism-related crime stories in South African history, a grim warning to travelers about the dangers of blind trust in strangers. Emily's disappearance was no longer just a personal tragedy, it was the key that uncovered years of hidden horrors. And though her body has never been found, her story remains the one that forced the world to see the shadows lurking behind the beauty of the wilderness.